Hello everyone. This is a dramatized work of fiction. Names, companies, and events are fictional. What if the person you treated as a burden was quietly holding your life together? Stay to the end for a story about ambition becoming neglect, forgiveness without reunion, and the love a child deserves after divorce. Subscribe, share this story, and tell us whether Mason can truly change. 38 floors above Manhattan, Mason Calloway signed a settlement he believed would simplify his future. A fountain pen scratched across expensive paper in a glass-walled conference room. Mason did not hesitate. His signature flowed confidently across the final page of a negotiated marital settlement before sliding it toward his attorney like a completed business decision. Outside, the city continued unaware of the marriage ending above it. Across the polished walnut table, Evelyn Hart remained perfectly still. 7 months pregnant, she rested one hand gently over her stomach while reading the document one last time. Her pale blue eyes never left the page. There were no tears or desperate pleas. The silence carried more weight than an argument. Mason leaned back in his leather chair and loosened his tie. "My attorney will file the uncontested case today," he said calmly. "Once the judge signs the judgment, it will be final. This is better for both of us." Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes toward him. She studied the man she once expected to grow old beside, now measuring life through profit, image, and advantage. Yet her voice remained remarkably gentle. "Are you absolutely certain?" she asked. Mason barely smiled. "I've never been more certain of anything." He glanced toward construction cranes beyond the windows. "You deserve a quieter life. I need someone who understands the world I'm building." Evelyn lowered her gaze without responding. She had heard similar words after investor dinners, missed anniversaries, and canceled medical appointments. Every excuse ended the same. Slowly, she signed her own name beneath his. Evelyn Hart. The settlement became binding between them, but the marriage would not legally end until a judge entered the divorce judgment. As she gathered her belongings, the sleeve of her cream-colored coat slipped slightly, revealing a slender platinum bracelet engraved with an unfamiliar crest. Mason noticed the crest, dismissed it as jewelry, and never asked where it came from. Evelyn stood carefully, adjusting the small leather handbag resting against her side. At the door, she paused. "I truly hope," she said softly, "that one day you find everything you're searching for." Mason nodded politely without standing. "Take care of yourself." She smiled faintly. "I intend to." Then she walked away. The door closed, and Mason turned to upcoming investor meetings without looking back. Downstairs, a black luxury sedan waited beside the curb. A driver opened the rear door. As the vehicle pulled away, Evelyn's phone vibrated and a familiar voice spoke. "Ms. Hart, your father has awakened. The board has unanimously moved the succession vote to Friday. They are waiting for their future chairwoman." Evelyn looked at Manhattan disappearing behind tinted glass. The woman Mason believed had walked out with little had just been called home to an enterprise larger than anything he had dreamed of building. He knew her as Evelyn Hart. The world she had left behind knew her by her birth name, Evelyn Sterling. People often believe a marriage collapses because of one terrible moment. The truth is far more unsettling. Most marriages disappear quietly, one ignored conversation at a time, until two strangers suddenly realize they are sharing the same house. 3 years earlier, before Calloway Urban Systems became one of Manhattan's fastest-growing development firms, Mason Calloway had been very different. Back then, success had not yet hardened his ambition into obsession. He was simply a talented architect carrying blueprints under one arm and impossible dreams inside his heart. Evelyn met him on a rainy October afternoon inside a neighborhood cafe where neither of them belonged. After business school, she legally adopted her late mother's surname, Hart, and declined every invitation to join her father's empire. Theodore Sterling had insisted on one condition: Evelyn would live privately, but never dishonestly. Her beneficial interests in family trusts remained separate property, and any legally required financial information would be disclosed through independent counsel. Mason later received those disclosures during the divorce, saw only trustees and protected account descriptions, and never asked what they meant. Theodore Sterling had warned her the experiment could end in heartbreak. Evelyn had only smiled and answered, "Then at least I'll know someone loved me before they knew my last name." Mason noticed her because she was reading an old architecture book that almost nobody recognized anymore. They spent 3 hours discussing historic train stations, forgotten cities, and why beautiful buildings mattered more than expensive ones. Neither asked about family wealth because neither believed it mattered. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt wonderfully invisible. Their relationship grew naturally. They rented a modest apartment overlooking the Hudson River, cooked simple dinners together, and celebrated small victories with inexpensive wine on the balcony. Mason once admitted that his greatest fear was becoming the kind of businessman who valued profit more than people. Evelyn laughed and promised she would never let that happen. She believed him, and so did he. Everything began changing after Calloway Urban Systems secured its first billion-dollar redevelopment contract. Success arrived faster than either expected. Interviews, photographs, and conferences soon filled Mason's calendar. The man who once rushed home carrying flowers now rushed between airports carrying contracts. At first, Evelyn accepted the sacrifices. She understood ambition because she had grown up watching it shape her own family. But there was one important difference. Theodore Sterling had always found time to return home for dinner, no matter how large the deal. Mason gradually stopped coming home at all. Anniversary dinners, weekends, and birthdays disappeared beneath meetings that always seemed more urgent than the woman waiting across the table. Then Victoria Hale entered Mason's company as executive communications advisor. Intelligent, polished, and relentlessly strategic, she believed every successful executive required a carefully designed public image. During one branding meeting, she asked a simple question. Why does your wife avoid every public event? Mason answered honestly. She dislikes attention. Victoria frowned slightly. Investors don't like mysteries. They prefer power couples. The suggestion lingered, and subtle disappointments began appearing in ordinary conversations. He questioned Evelyn's quiet lifestyle. He encouraged designer wardrobes she never wanted. He asked why she refused interviews and charity galas attended by billionaires. She always answered with the same gentle smile. Because I married you, not your reputation. Months later, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. Her hands trembled with excitement as she waited inside the doctor's office for Mason to arrive at the first ultrasound appointment. She watched couples celebrate together while checking the entrance every few minutes. His chair remained empty. Finally, her phone vibrated. I'm sorry, Mason texted. An investor from Singapore landed early. We'll schedule another appointment. She stared until the screen dimmed, then entered the examination room alone. That afternoon, she heard her baby's heartbeat for the very first time. Mason never did. When she returned home carrying the tiny ultrasound photograph, she found another business suit hanging by the bedroom door and another overnight flight already booked. She slipped the picture into the drawer beside their bed, believing there would always be another chance to share that beautiful moment together. She had no idea that the silence growing between them had already become louder than love itself. Sometimes the cruelest betrayals are not hidden behind lies. They are written plainly in words that one person never expected the other to read. The rain had stopped by the time Evelyn stepped out of the downtown office building. Manhattan moved around her with its usual restless rhythm. Taxis weaving through traffic, while thousands of strangers hurried toward destinations that suddenly seemed far less important than the child quietly growing beneath her heart. Naomi Pierce was already waiting beside a silver sedan. She had been Evelyn's closest friend since law school, one of the very few people outside the Sterling family who knew the truth about her identity. The moment Evelyn settled into the passenger seat, Naomi looked at her face and understood everything without asking. He signed, Evelyn said softly, staring through the windshield. Naomi exhaled slowly before starting the engine. Neither woman spoke for several blocks. Finally, Naomi reached into a leather folder resting beside the console. There's something you need to see. Evelyn accepted the folder with quiet curiosity. Inside were printed copies of internal emails delivered to Naomi, as counsel, by a company whistleblower who had preserved the original metadata and requested lawful protection. She recognized Mason's name immediately. At first, the messages discussed investor meetings and branding strategies. Then one sentence caught her attention. Our current family image has become a reputational liability with institutional partners. Mason had written those words 6 months earlier during a discussion with Victoria Hale. Another email followed. A more visible spouse would strengthen executive confidence. Victoria's reply arrived only minutes later. Then perhaps the personal situation should be resolved before the next funding cycle. Evelyn read every page without changing expression. She did not cry. She did not close the folder in anger. Instead, she quietly returned every document to its place and rested both hands upon her stomach. Naomi finally broke the silence. "We can preserve these for the divorce and for any lawful corporate review," Naomi said. "But I will not publish confidential records or make claims we cannot prove." Evelyn slowly shook her head. "No, Evelyn. No public spectacle and no revenge. Give them only to the lawyers who are entitled to review them." Naomi looked at her in disbelief. "After everything they've done?" Evelyn smiled sadly. "If I have to destroy someone to prove my worth, then I've already lost." The car continued north through the city. As sunlight finally broke through the clouds, Evelyn removed her wedding ring for the first time since her marriage. She turned it gently between her fingers before placing it inside the empty envelope that had once contained their vows. She did not look at it again. Across town, the atmosphere inside Calloway Urban Systems could not have been more different. Champagne glasses clinked inside the executive conference room as senior managers celebrated what Mason hoped would become the company's largest refinancing agreement. Laughter filled the room, while presentation screens displayed expansion projects stretching across 3 continents. Mason appeared relaxed for the first time in months. Victoria stood nearby, discussing media strategy for the upcoming announcement, convinced that the divorce would simplify his public image before the investor roadshow. Then Marcus Reed quietly entered carrying a tablet. His expression immediately erased the celebration. "Mason," he said carefully, "our primary insurance partner has opened the scheduled risk reassessment on the Harbor District development." Mason frowned. "Why?" "The project is late, and our debt assumptions changed after the original submission." Marcus nodded. "There's something else." He enlarged the email displayed across the screen. The message itself sounded professional, almost routine. However, the signature block at the bottom captured everyone's attention. "Sterling Dominion Risk Partners." The room suddenly became silent. Mason stared at the unfamiliar company name for several seconds. He had barely noticed the Sterling Dominion name in earlier disclosures, yet something about it now felt familiar. He dismissed the thought and reached for another champagne glass. Hundreds of miles away, inside the quiet cabin of a private jet preparing for departure, Evelyn looked down at the envelope containing her wedding ring one final time before sealing it shut. As the aircraft lifted above the clouds, she whispered almost to herself, "Let every consequence arrive on its own." She had no intention of fighting the man she once loved. She simply walked away, unaware that Mason's own financing assumptions were already beginning to receive the scrutiny he had avoided. Sometimes the most powerful people never need to announce who they are. The world reveals their importance long before they ever speak a single word. The private jet descended through a blanket of pale morning clouds before touching down on a secluded runway in Connecticut. Unlike the crowded terminals of commercial airports, everything here moved with quiet precision. Black vehicles waited in perfect alignment. Security officers stood respectfully beside the entrance without unnecessary conversation. The moment the cabin door opened, the crisp autumn air greeted Evelyn as she stepped carefully onto the staircase, one hand instinctively resting over the life growing beneath her heart. She had not returned home in more than 3 years. A chauffeur approached without hesitation. "Welcome home, Miss Sterling." Evelyn smiled politely. "Thank you, Samuel." The elderly driver had served her family since she was a child. His eyes softened when he noticed her pregnancy, though professionalism kept him from asking questions. Instead, he quietly placed her luggage into the waiting sedan before closing the door behind her. During the drive through winding tree-lined roads, familiar landscapes slowly returned like forgotten memories. Stone bridges crossed quiet rivers. Endless rows of ancient oak trees guarded the private estate hidden beyond carefully preserved forests. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. She had left this place believing love was waiting somewhere beyond privilege. She was returning carrying both a child and a broken heart. 20 minutes later, towering wrought iron gates silently opened before the approaching convoy. The Sterling estate stretched across rolling hills beneath the morning sun, its elegant limestone mansion overlooking immaculate gardens that had belonged to the family for generations. Employees standing near the entrance immediately straightened as the vehicles approached. None applauded. None rushed forward dramatically. Instead, they simply bowed their heads with sincere respect. They were not welcoming an heiress returning from vacation. They were greeting the woman many believed would soon become the future of everything they had spent their lives helping to build. Evelyn stepped from the vehicle slowly. Naomi walked beside her carrying only a single leather folder. Before either woman reached the front entrance, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s approached with measured confidence. Arthur Bennett had served as chairman of the Sterling Family Council longer than Evelyn had been alive. "Miss Sterling," he said warmly, "your father has been asking for you every morning since he regained consciousness." Evelyn's composure finally wavered. "How is he?" Arthur smiled gently. "Strong enough to argue with his doctors again." A quiet laugh escaped her for the first time in weeks. "Then he's recovering." Arthur nodded before lowering his voice. "The board unanimously postponed the succession vote until you arrived. They refused to proceed without the rightful successor present." Evelyn glanced toward the mansion's tall windows. "I never wanted anyone waiting for me." "Leadership," Arthur replied calmly, "has never been about what you wanted." Inside the mansion, marble hallways echoed beneath soft footsteps as portraits of previous Sterling generations watched silently from polished walls. Every painting represented decades of responsibility rather than luxury. Theodore Sterling had often reminded his daughter that wealth was temporary, but reputation could survive centuries. Outside one quiet bedroom overlooking the eastern gardens, Evelyn stopped to steady her breathing. Arthur gently opened the door. Theodore Sterling sat beside the window wearing a dark cashmere robe, sunlight illuminating silver hair that illness had noticeably thinned. He looked older than she remembered, frilier, yet his blue eyes remained exactly the same, calm, observant, impossible to deceive. The moment he saw his daughter standing there, visibly pregnant and exhausted despite her graceful smile, he slowly rose without speaking. Evelyn crossed the room before embracing him carefully. Neither apologized. Neither explained anything. The silence between father and daughter carried years of understanding words could never improve. Finally, Theodore rested one hand against her shoulder. "You came home," he whispered. Evelyn closed her eyes. "I should have come sooner." Theodore looked gently toward her wedding ring, or rather the empty place where it had once rested. He did not ask where Mason was. He did not ask why she had returned alone. Instead, his gaze settled upon the child she carried. "You came home," he repeated softly, "before anyone convinced you that your light was meant to grow smaller." A single tear slipped quietly down Evelyn's cheek. Outside the bedroom, members of the Sterling Family Council gathered silently, waiting for the daughter they had protected from afar. None of them yet realized that the greatest decision she would make was not accepting an empire. It would be refusing to use that empire as a weapon. The moment a powerful illusion begins to collapse, the first thing people lose is not money. It is certainty. 3 days after the marital settlement was signed, Mason Calloway stood inside the executive boardroom, watching a presentation that no longer looked as optimistic as it had only a week earlier. The colorful growth charts remained on the giant display, but the confidence in the room had quietly disappeared. Every discussion now began with the same phrase: pending additional review. Marcus Reed closed another video conference before rubbing his forehead in frustration. "That's the fourth institution today." Mason remained standing beside the panoramic window overlooking Manhattan. "Did anyone actually reject us?" Marcus shook his head. "No." "Then why does everyone suddenly sound afraid?" There was no immediate answer. That uncertainty disturbed Mason far more than an outright refusal would have. By early afternoon, another report landed on his desk. The project's insurer had raised projected premiums because construction was behind schedule. A pension fund postponed participation until Calloway added independent directors. 2 lenders requested updated cash flow tests. Each institution made its own decision, and none accused the company of wrongdoing. They were reacting to the same weaknesses: aggressive debt, concentrated revenue, and governance built around Mason alone. Marcus entered carrying a binder of ownership records. "2 firms in our financing chain are Sterling Dominion affiliates," he said. "The others are independent, but they can all see the same risk data. Mason studied the name appearing on the insurer and the proposed refinancing fund, Sterling Dominion Holdings. Who are they? Mason asked quietly. Marcus hesitated before answering. That's the strange part. They almost never appear publicly. They operate through subsidiaries, partnerships, and private investment structures. Most people outside institutional finance barely recognize the name. Mason crossed his arms. So why are they everywhere? Marcus looked directly at him. Because they don't need attention to have influence. Silence settled between them. Mason suddenly remembered the unfamiliar company's signature attached to the insurance review. Sterling Dominion Risk Partners. He also remembered something else. A small platinum bracelet on Evelyn's wrist. An engraved crest he had dismissed without a second thought. The image flashed briefly through his memory before disappearing again. It couldn't possibly matter, could it? Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Evelyn spent the afternoon inside a quiet library at the Sterling estate reviewing succession documents with Arthur Bennett. Thick leather-bound reports covered the long oak table, detailing investments across energy, shipping, healthcare, insurance, and technology. Arthur paused before closing one folder. The affiliated insurer and credit fund have both opened their normal reviews. Outside institutions are conducting their own. Evelyn looked up. I want a written recusal. I will not receive committee materials or speak to anyone deciding Mason's financing. Arthur nodded. Outside counsel has already documented it. Good. People are responsible for evaluating risk. They are not responsible for protecting someone's pride. Arthur smiled faintly. Theodore had once spoken almost those exact words. Later that evening, Theodore joined his daughter on the mansion's western terrace as the sun disappeared beyond the hills. Do you know what's happening? He asked quietly. Evelyn watched golden light fade across the gardens. Yes. Does it satisfy you? She answered without hesitation. No. Theodore seemed relieved. Then your judgment is still clear. Back in Manhattan, Mason remained alone inside his office long after every employee had gone home. The city lights reflected against the dark glass as he opened an online archive containing old photographs from company events. Hundreds of images passed before him until one picture froze his attention. Evelyn stood quietly in the background during a charity gala years earlier. The sleeve of her evening dress had slipped just enough to reveal that same platinum bracelet. This time Mason zoomed in. Beneath the polished metal, the tiny crest became unmistakably clear. It matched the emblem displayed throughout Marcus's research binder. Mason felt an unfamiliar chill settle across the room. For the first time since signing the settlement, one impossible question entered his mind. What if the woman he believed knew nothing about power had been surrounded by it long before she ever met him? Some truths do not explode into the world. They simply walk onto a stage, and everyone else rises to their feet. The North Atlantic Capital Forum had long been considered one of the most exclusive gatherings in global finance. Invitations could not be purchased. Attendance could not be negotiated. Every chair inside the grand ballroom belonged to someone responsible for shaping industries rather than merely participating in them. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors while quiet conversations drifted between investment executives, sovereign wealth representatives, and corporate leaders from around the world. Mason Calloway adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit as he entered the hall. Under different circumstances, he would have felt proud to stand among such influential people. Instead, the uncertainty that had shadowed him throughout the past week refused to disappear. Every delayed investment, every cautious lender, every unanswered question seemed to lead back toward one unfamiliar name. Sterling Dominion. Marcus walked beside him carrying the conference schedule. The keynote speaker is still listed as confidential, he whispered. Mason glanced at the program again. Only one line appeared beneath the afternoon session. Future leadership in global capital. Speaker to be announced. Strange, Mason muttered. Someone important, Marcus replied. Otherwise they wouldn't keep it secret. Across the city, a black executive vehicle arrived through a private entrance reserved for keynote guests. Evelyn stepped out slowly, dressed in an elegant midnight blue maternity gown that reflected quiet confidence rather than extravagance. Her honey blonde hair rested neatly across her shoulders, and the same platinum bracelet circled her wrist beneath the sleeve of her tailored coat. Arthur Bennett walked beside her carrying a slim leather portfolio. The press has been instructed to respect your privacy, he said. Evelyn smiled gently. Today isn't about me. Arthur looked toward the conference center towering above them. Whether you want it or not, today will be remembered because of you. Back inside the ballroom, conversations gradually faded as the lights dimmed. A single spotlight illuminated the enormous stage while the event moderator approached the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. Our next speaker represents not only one of the world's most respected family enterprises, but also the next generation of leadership shaping global investment for decades to come. A quiet murmur spread across the audience. Mason leaned forward instinctively. Behind the speaker, the massive screen slowly illuminated with an elegant silver crest. Mason froze. His breathing almost stopped. The symbol was unmistakable. It was identical to the tiny emblem engraved on Evelyn's bracelet. Before he could process the realization, the moderator continued. Please join me in welcoming the incoming chairwoman of Sterling Dominion Group, Ms. Evelyn Sterling, known in her private life for years as Evelyn Hart. For one suspended heartbeat, nobody moved. Then several elderly financiers in the front row rose to their feet. Others immediately followed. Within seconds, the entire ballroom stood together in respectful applause that echoed beneath the crystal ceiling. Mason remained frozen in place. His eyes never left the stage as Evelyn walked calmly into the spotlight. She carried herself with effortless dignity, one hand resting gently over the child she would soon bring into the world. There was no arrogance in her expression, no desire to impress, only quiet confidence earned long before anyone in the room had learned her name. Mason felt every memory crash together at once. The small apartment, the missed medical appointment, the unsigned anniversary card, the platinum bracelet, and the settlement papers. Every moment suddenly rearranged itself into a truth he had never imagined. He had not married an ordinary woman hiding behind extraordinary wealth. He had married an extraordinary woman who had willingly lived an ordinary life simply to discover whether someone could love her without knowing who she really was. The applause slowly faded as Evelyn reached the podium. She looked across hundreds of distinguished faces before her eyes briefly swept across the audience. For only an instant, her gaze met Mason's. She neither smiled nor looked away. She simply acknowledged his presence with the same quiet composure she had shown the day he signed their divorce. Then she turned toward the microphone. Somewhere in the back of the ballroom, one veteran financial journalist quietly whispered to a colleague, "Remember this moment. Business history isn't changing because someone inherited an empire. It's changing because a millionaire just realized he had willingly walked away from the woman everyone else had spent years preparing to lead one of the country's most respected private financial groups." The loudest apology is often the one that arrives after it can no longer change anything. The applause inside the ballroom faded into respectful silence as Evelyn Sterling adjusted the microphone. Hundreds of executives, investors, and financial leaders waited for the woman many had heard about, but few had ever seen in public. She looked across the audience with calm blue eyes before beginning in a voice so composed that every corner of the room seemed to lean closer. "When people inherit influence," she said, "they're usually taught how to preserve it. I was taught something different. I was taught to live without it first." The audience remained completely still. 3 years ago, I chose not to introduce myself by my family name. I wanted to discover whether respect could exist without reputation, kindness without power, and love without privilege. She paused briefly, resting one gentle hand over her unborn daughter. The lesson was more valuable than I expected. No bitterness entered her voice. She never mentioned Mason. She never described the divorce. She never asked for sympathy. Instead, she spoke about responsibility, humility, long-term leadership, and the importance of protecting people before protecting balance sheets. By the time she finished, the entire ballroom rose once again in sustained applause. Several veteran investors quietly wiped away tears they had not expected to shed during a finance conference. Later that afternoon, one respected financial publication would summarize the keynote with a single sentence. The future chairwoman reminded the market that character remains the rarest form of capital. Mason remained seated long after everyone else began moving toward the reception hall. He barely heard the conversations surrounding him. Every word Evelyn had spoken echoed against memories he could no longer escape. He remembered asking her to skip quiet weekends because another investor dinner mattered more. He remembered dismissing her opinions about leadership because she never spoke loudly enough to command attention. Most painfully, he remembered the morning she had waited alone to hear the heartbeat of their child. For the first time in years, success no longer felt like victory. It felt painfully empty. As evening settled over the conference center, Mason quietly asked one of the event coordinators whether he could speak with Ms. Sterling privately. 20 minutes later, he was escorted into a quiet terrace overlooking the city skyline. Evelyn stood beside the stone railing beneath the soft glow of evening lights. She did not turn immediately when she heard his footsteps. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Mason said quietly. Evelyn looked toward the city before finally facing him. "What did you want to say?" The confidence that had once defined him seemed to have disappeared. "I was wrong." The words came slowly. "About you. About us. About almost everything." Evelyn listened without interruption. "I thought ambition justified every sacrifice. I convinced myself that building a company mattered more than protecting the people waiting for me at home." He lowered his eyes. "I kept believing there would always be another anniversary, another dinner, and another chance." The silence between them felt almost unbearable. Finally, Mason looked directly at her. "I'm sorry." Evelyn studied him for a long moment before asking one quiet question. "If my last name had never changed, if I had remained the woman you believed I was, would you still be standing here tonight?" Mason opened his mouth to answer. No words came, because for the first time in his life, honesty demanded silence. Evelyn gave a small, understanding nod. She reached into the portfolio Naomi had prepared and removed 2 documents. "This is our signed settlement. The uncontested case has been filed, but only the judge can enter the final divorce judgment." She placed a second folder beside it. "This is a proposed parenting plan for us to review with counsel after our daughter is born. It covers decision-making, support, medical information, and regular parenting time." Mason looked up. "You believe I can still be her father?" "You are her father," Evelyn replied. "The question is whether you will become a dependable one. That will be measured by what you do consistently, not by what you promised tonight." She also told him that Calloway's board had received the preserved emails through its own counsel. The directors, not Evelyn, would decide whether Victoria's conduct violated company policy. There would be no public humiliation and no private revenge, only a documented governance review. Evelyn offered one final compassionate smile before leaving. Forgiveness was not the same as returning to a life she had outgrown. Mason remained beneath the evening sky holding papers that would end his marriage only after court review while preserving a path toward responsible fatherhood. For the first time, he understood that losing Evelyn had never been the consequence of one signature. It had been the consequence of every moment that signature represented. About 2 months later, the first rays of a spring sunrise entered St. Catherine's Medical Center as Evelyn gave birth to a healthy daughter at 39 weeks. She named her Grace Theodore Hart Sterling, not to burden the child with a dynasty, but to honor the 2 family lines that had shaped her mother's life. Theodore Sterling held his granddaughter with both hands and none of the authority he carried into a boardroom. "Welcome to the family, Grace," he whispered. Mason waited outside the maternity wing exactly as Evelyn had requested. During the final weeks of pregnancy, he had attended only the appointments to which she invited him. He did not appear unexpectedly, send expensive gifts, or use the press to advertise remorse. When a nurse finally told him he could enter, he walked into the room carrying a small handmade blanket. "May I hold her?" he asked. Evelyn nodded and placed Grace in his arms. The baby opened her eyes briefly, then settled against his chest. Mason cried without embarrassment. "Hello, Grace. I have a great deal to learn." "You do," Evelyn said gently. "Start by being here when it is ordinary." The court entered the divorce judgment after reviewing the parties' settlement and confirming that both had signed voluntarily. Once Grace was born, their lawyers completed a parenting agreement that the court approved as serving the child's best interests. It provided shared access to medical and school information, scheduled parenting time, child support, notice before travel, and a process for resolving disagreements without placing Grace between them. Calloway Urban Systems also completed an independent governance review. The board found no criminal conduct, but it concluded that Victoria Hale had blurred professional communications with Mason's personal life, and had promoted a misleading idea that investors required a different spouse. She resigned. Mason accepted the board's conclusion without blaming her for his decision to end the marriage. He sold speculative assets, reduced debt, appointed independent directors, and rebuilt the company at a smaller scale. Growth came slowly, but it rested on stronger foundations. More important, he followed the parenting order. He arrived on time, learned Grace's feeding schedule, attended medical appointments, and never treated parenting time as something that could be moved for a meeting. Evelyn became chairwoman of Sterling Dominion Group. Her first major initiative was the Grace Foundation, which provided legal information, financial education, childcare referrals, and practical assistance to expectant parents facing separation. The foundation did not encourage divorce or reconciliation. It helped families make informed choices without fear or financial coercion. 2 years later, Evelyn and Mason met beside a quiet lake in a botanical garden. Grace laughed as she scattered approved birdseed toward the ducks. Mason checked the backpack Evelyn had packed, and Evelyn reminded him about a mild allergy and the next pediatric appointment. Their conversation was calm and ordinary. There was warmth between them, but no suggestion that the marriage should return. Mason had apologized. Evelyn had forgiven him. Neither confused forgiveness with restored trust. Grace reached for her father, and Mason lifted her carefully. Ready to go? She waved at Evelyn over his shoulder. Evelyn smiled and waved back. Mason no longer followed Evelyn when she turned toward another path. He understood that love could survive as respect, responsibility, and cooperation even when a marriage could not. Evelyn understood that strength did not require punishment, and Grace would grow up knowing that her parents' greatest achievement was not wealth, status, or even forgiveness. It was their decision to stop using loss as a weapon and begin using responsibility as a promise.